Welcome to the presentation about storing carbon in trees and products. That's an important connection. My name is Cy Balch. I'm a Maine licensed forester, and here is my picture. This is not just a picture of me, which is the least important part. This picture encompasses a bunch of things. The wood on the sides of this are 2x6s that were sawn from timber, cut on our land, sawn out, and used to build this woodshed. The wood piled in the shed is our primary heat source. We have a couple of years worth of wood drying in this shed. And interestingly enough, the tree in the background will be harvested at some point and sawn into lumber, sold for products. So this one slide holds a lot of information. I do have a background working in Maine for the last 50 years for a variety of owners, both industrial and private and nonprofit. So it's a nice combination. Plus, I've traveled to some different parts of the world. This slide is important because a group of landowners were asked if they wanted to be a part of a group called the Climate Smart Land Network, starting in about 2007 or 8. And you might be interested to look at this group of owners. They own 33 million acres across the US and Canada. And the project was that this group, sponsored by Manomet, would provide them with information about changing climates that they could put into use on their land. All of these volunteered to participate in that and receive this information. And this organization continues today. Some people may join it, some people may drop out, but the concept remains valuable and continuing. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about how people, and all people, basically respond. Changes made by us are okay. Changes made by others are suspect. It was like that when I got here, so it's okay. There's a lovely beach east of Ellsworth called Jasper Beach. And in the background is this huge dome-shaped communications tower, multicolored. It's there, therefore it's okay. If I had gotten there and somebody proposed that they were going to build it, I probably would have had questions. An interesting example. There's an interesting word called solastalgia, which is recognized as a form of emotional distress and bewilderment that arises when one's home ground is unrecognizable through environmental change. So this is real. If it happens to you, it has a name. It's also interesting that humans are in awe of things that are bigger than us and things that live longer than we do. We put things in human scale, and trees are both bigger and longer lived. Another point is we are afraid of being surprised and possibly pounced upon. This is our monkey brain, which works. Sight distance is critical in easing this response. So if we can see about 75 feet, we feel better. If you walk through the woods and there's a solid line of trees beside you, you can't see through, you're unconsciously nervous. If you can see further, you're less nervous. We're also afraid of being lost. I don't know how many people I've talked to over the years that are just afraid to go in the woods because they're afraid they won't be able to find their way out again. My suggestion is carry a roll of flagging and tie a piece every once in a while, and if you want to get out, follow your line of flagging. There is a wonderful idea that comes from the German, the idea of being alone in the woods. It might seem scary or unsettling, but it is definitely a positive thing. It suggests a calm, contemplative atmosphere amidst a beautiful setting. If you've ever taken a solitary stroll through the forest and felt better for it, then you understand. The concept of carbon projects is evolving rapidly. It started about 13 to 15 years ago and is growing and being worldwide discussions. This chart is important because it shows all the different kinds of projects that are called carbon, which means that they basically remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The three that are highlighted: improved forest management, afforestation, which means planting trees, and reforestation, which also means not necessarily planting, but growing forests from young forests to mature forests, and forest conservation and restoration. Those are the three that will be discussed as this goes forward. All those other things are in existence and helpful in this discussion. So let's talk a little bit about science. If you leave New England alone, it's covered with trees, except for some wetlands. Fields, pastures, lawns, and gardens are unnatural. These cleared areas do provide sight distance and a feeling of increased safety, as well as crops and other things, but if we stop keeping them open, they'll go back to trees. As the climate changes, the forest will also, but pretty slowly in human terms. New England will most likely get wetter and warmer, more downpours, less showers, more in the winter, and drier summers. This last summer was particularly wet and an anomaly. We'll see what happens next, but overall, probably drier summers. How will organisms move in response to change? The more mobile ones will move first. Insects, diseases, birds, animals, plants, and then trees. Trees basically move when their seeds move and a new one sprouts. It is interesting that some things are happening. Some of the hurricanes this past year are blowing southern birds north. There have been flamingos in Ohio. It's also interesting that Maine now has possums. Never used to have possums, now we do. Some animals that are here already, deer will thrive for sure. One of their primary population controls in the past was winter kill. They starved or they were hunted by coyotes and other animals pretty easily in deep snow. Well, as deep snow disappears and it gets warmer, there are going to be more deer. Hardwood regeneration is likely to diminish because when there are lots of deer, they eat lots of things, and one of them is hardwood tree regeneration. So growing wood is good, and some trees are better at it. This shows different growth in tons per acre per year. That's tons of wood. So the boreal forest, basically meaning northern Canada in our part of the world, grows about 0.4 tons per acre per year. Here in Maine, the average growth across the state is about 1 ton per acre per year. And this eucalyptus forest that's in Hawaii is growing 18 tons per acre per year. So all trees and their storage ability are not created equal. These are some rough rules of thumb for biomass, carbon, and carbon dioxide. The total biomass acceptable by carbon traders is about 2 times the biomass of the traditional merchantable tree. This means traditionally the stem, the nice, clean, straight, not particularly branchy chunk of the tree is what's normally used. The branches are not normally used. But if you're talking about total biomass, then all the top of the tree and all the branches and everything else is in fact part of the biomass that you can then deal with as stored in the tree. Greenwood is about 50% water. Dry wood is about 50% carbon. The CO2 equivalent is 3.67 times the weight of dry carbon. 1 ton of green wood keeps 0.92 tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There is a very rapidly evolving stored carbon market. Stored carbon in living trees is now a forest product, just like any other traditional forest product, just like lumber, just like firewood, just like pulpwood. Instead of growing lumber, pulpwood, or firewood, landowners can now grow stored carbon and sell it. This is brand new. Thus, every tree in the world now has an economic value for two products. Their definitions and valuation processes are rapidly evolving. Um, this is stay tuned. The carbon market concept. Rather than stopping producing carbon dioxide entirely, the purchaser can offset their amount produced by removing an equivalent amount and storing it for a set period of time. It's like a conservation easement or others, where it is you set aside the rights to remove it for a period of time, and you're paid for that set aside. With carbon dioxide stored in wood, it is either in a living tree or in a long-lived wooden product. This is the Portland, Maine airport. And you can see that a lot of wood went into the construction of the roof of this. And it is specifically here, well, it's specifically done, one, because it's beautiful and is a wonderful construction material, but also it's storing a lot of carbon. This is a brand new building. You can see it's 4 stories, built in what's called mass timber construction. So there's very little steel in this building. The timbers and the frames and everything else is wood, in order to put wood aside from putting its carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Those are the new ones. These are some of the old ones. One of the reasons that covered bridges were developed was that if you put a roof over the bridge lasted much, much longer. It didn't rot. These were all stone and wooden construction to start with. So that bridge has been around for at least 100 years. The house on the right was built in the mid 1600s in New England and is still here. So wood can last in buildings a long time. Mandatory and voluntary carbon storage. When you get into the weeds to some extent with this is an important difference. Mandatory is when carbon dioxide emission reduction is ordered by a government. The time commitment of this agreement is normally 100 years. Only the tree volume above the FIA regional average is sold, and I'll explain FIA. The U.S. Forest Service, starting in the 1940s, put into place permanent sample plots across the United States. And the acronym for that is Forest Inventory and Analysis, FIA, run by the U.S. Forest Service. Those plots are remeasured every 10 years. And that is the basis for the United States basically understanding what's out there in the woods. So in California, what happens is that the only can sell volume over the FIA regional average. So they want you to do something in addition to what is normal. The FIA average for that particular kind of forest in that particular place is known because of the good work by the U.S. Forest Service. You take that average and say things that are above that average can be sold as stored carbon. Only that which is above, because it's seen as an extra added effort that isn't normally occurring. In California and Washington, all major emitters have a cap and trade system. Cap and trade means that the government says, okay, producer of carbon dioxide, you can produce this much carbon dioxide, that's allowed, but we put a cap on it. You can only produce 500, whatever it is, 500 tons of carbon dioxide. And anything above that, then you have to go and buy carbon credits. The concept with cap and trade, both in the EU and the US and other places is being used, is to gradually reduce that cap over time. So this year it's 500, a couple of years from now it's 400, a couple of years after that it's 300. And so the producer has to continually try to either modify their process and reduce their output, or they have to buy more carbon credits and set them aside. Voluntary is when CO2 emission reduction is sufficiently important to an enterprise that they purchase stored carbon. In this case, the time commitment is normally 40 years. And also, it's interesting that the full tree standing volume can be sold, not just that which is above FIA. This is an evolving market, um, but it is the voluntary side where you don't have to do it. You're a company that is producing carbon dioxide. Say you're an airline. It's famous for airlines. Airlines are doing this quite a lot. They're flying airplanes back and forth around the world, and they're emitting carbon dioxide, but they want to be good citizens, and so they are trying to try to create systems that set aside carbon dioxide to offset some of their emissions. Okay, now we're getting into the weeds. Mandatory carbon credits around the world, cap and trade programs exist in some form in the US, Canada, the EU, the UK, China, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, with many more countries and states considering implementation. The value is somewhere between, this is worldwide markets, this is somewhere between $26 and $32 per ton of sequestered carbon dioxide. Sequestered, yes, but per ton of carbon dioxide that is offset by sequestration. The voluntary market, carbon offsets, organizations with operations or agreements with landowners that reduce the amount of carbon already in the atmosphere by reducing harvesting, planting more trees, or investing in renewable energy can issue offsets credits. The purchase of these offsets is voluntary, which is why carbon offsets form what's known as the voluntary carbon market. However, by buying these carbon offsets, companies can measurably decrease the amount of CO2 that they emit even further. Their price is surprisingly similar. Remember, in the mandatory, it's set aside for 100 years. In the voluntary, it's set aside for 40 years. RGGI, which is called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, basically it includes most of the states from Maine to Virginia. It's a really interesting website if you go to it. They're dealing only with larger power plants, so they're not dealing with other factories and things that are producing carbon at this point. They are working with power plants. They do include various methods of carbon dioxide emission reduction. And it's important to know that there are many different ways to do this besides dealing with trees. Landfill methane, sulfur hexafluoride, forestry or afforestation is part of it. Efficiency, avoided agricultural methane. So if you go to this website, you can learn a lot about it. Since 2008, RGGI emissions have reduced by more than 50%, twice as fast as the nation as a whole. In other words, they're being pretty successful. I'm not going to try to describe everything that's on this World Bank website, but if you want to explore and learn a lot about the worldwide carbon market and pricing, go to this website. They describe their systems as either ETS, emission trading system, or carbon tax. The ETS is essentially the same as cap and trade. It's a different set of letters, but it means very much the same thing. This is a map. You don't have to memorize the map. The purpose of the map is simply to show the countries of the world that are participating or really thinking about participating in carbon control of some kind. It's impressive in two ways. It's impressive that there are so many different things being considered in different places. It's also unimpressive in the fact that there are a number of countries that are not doing anything at the moment, including most of the US. You can see RGGI in the northeast part of the US, and you can see California and Washington in the western part of the US. This is 12 companies that are buying voluntary credits and why. So companies of all sizes are facing an uphill battle when it comes to reaching their net zero and carbon neutral targets. But carbon offsets can help counteract unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, they can't stop emitting, but they can get credits to offset those. In contrast, carbon reduction strategies, which aim to eliminate emissions internally, carbon offsets work by funding greenhouse gas reduction projects outside the company's value chain, which may sound like gobbledygook, but it's basically important because money is a big part of this discussion. Here's a list of 12 companies that are seriously involved in buying carbon credits to offset the emissions from their particular enterprise. And it's a very interesting list. Google, okay. Cemex is a cement maker, and the cement making process emits a lot of carbon dioxide, and they're working on it. Delta Airlines, Disney, General Motors, Honeywell, JetBlue, Microsoft, Pacific Gas and Electric, Salesforce, which is a cloud-based software company, okay, Shell Oil, and Unilever. And there are many others, but this is a pretty interesting sort of grab bag of companies that are really out there trying to address this issue. This is two examples of businesses that develop carbon projects for large landowners and sell stored carbon. The purpose of these companies is basically like a realtor. They go to somebody that has something for sale. They help that owner develop or understand or market, package, however you want to say it, their carbon, their stored carbon, and then they go and find buyers and help make the deal. And this, I won't bother to read all of these, but these are two companies that have been around for a while. There are more companies, many more than this, but these are two of the larger ones in the United States. They have slightly different methods, but the project is the same: develop saleable carbon offsets and connect the buyer and the seller. These are some examples of businesses that develop carbon projects for smaller owners, and it says 500 acres plus. So for most of us that own 50 acres or 10 acres, there really is not a market. It is a real challenge because of the efficiencies. If you get into the California system, it's expensive to maintain the records that show that you are in fact doing what you're doing. You can go measure it yourself, but then you have to hire a third party to come and check your work. There's a lot of costs in satisfying the buyers that they are in fact buying what is worth buying. So here we have three that are trying to work with smaller landowners. Oftentimes they will try to bring several smaller owners together in the same place and make it more efficient. Forest Carbon Works, Family Forest Carbon, and SIG Carbon. And the websites are there for all of them. They do the same thing. Like realtors, they try to create a saleable product of stored carbon. Then comes the question of verifying projects. There's been a lot of discussion about, is it valid? Is it doing what it says it's doing? And so outfits appear and are created to try to verify, like the first one here, Verified Carbon Standard, second, Climate Action Reserve, the Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry. All of these are out there for the purpose of trying to judge and help the public and buyers have an understanding of sort of the quality of these people, how they judge it, the quality of what they're buying. And this is evolving rapidly. There are some programs which are very, very robust. There are other ones which are started that might be a good idea, but they're not quite as robust as they ought to be. They may fall by the wayside. Other projects, other methods may well evolve. This is a critical issue. A question in all of this is how we can really reduce carbon dioxide emissions through carbon storage and still meet the world's need for wood. Storing wood in one place and then harvesting equivalent wood volume elsewhere does not reduce emissions. Storing carbon in a forest is a good step, but it is an illusion to think that it helps the world's atmosphere if an equivalent amount of wood is simply cut elsewhere. Cutting wood elsewhere is known as leakage. So this is the big picture. To deal with this world problem, we must assess world wood and trees and tree uses. Does the amount of wood cut exceed the amount grown worldwide? Can we meet our wood needs and increase the amount of carbon stored in living trees and at the same time through intensified forest management practices? We want the wood products, the jobs created by their production and the storing of carbon dioxide in wood products. We want to maintain and increase the amount of carbon dioxide sequestered in living trees. We must study and understand and decide how much wood we will use in traditional products, and then focus on trees that can better be used to sequester carbon. There will be healthy competition emerging between these two valuable uses. Stored carbon has been bought and sold for the last 15 years. Price competition will be the system that eventually allocates trees to various uses. At some point, the ecological values of trees may be assigned a monetary value and thus add a third use to the market discussion. So how much wood is there and how much are we using? This is 30 years worth of data from the UN. The UN is a pretty good outfit that keeps pretty good track of what's going on in the world. So, in millions of cubic meters, in 1990, there were 560 million cubic meters of live wood growing. In 2020, there were 557 million cubic meters of live wood growing. That's a 0.005% change, essentially no change. What does this tell us? We're using the total growth. So there is no surplus wood to set aside to store carbon. Phooey. Now what? Improve forest management and store carbon in either trees or products or other changes. When I was developing this, it struck me there is a really interesting case with paper. We have drastically reduced printing information by switching to electronic communications. Defunct paper mill in the defunct paper mill in Madison has come roaring back to life with a new product: high-performance wood fiber insulation for homes and other buildings. The University of Maine Bioproducts Research Institute is trying to develop and is developing new products based upon sustainable bioproducts in three major categories: fuels, chemicals, and advanced materials. The case of paper, to go back to it, this was not done with the intention of using less wood and therefore storing carbon. It was done because we've switched to electronic communication and therefore much less paper is used. You look at the size of the newspapers that we get today, they're shrunk a whole lot. What are they shrunk by? Not the information, but by advertising. Advertising is going electric. Advertising is the lifeblood of most newspapers. It's a very interesting transition. So, a lot less paper, a lot more electronic communication, a lot more wood left in trees, living trees. So, a couple of nice pictures. This is a hardwood stand, just northwest of Ellsworth, owned by a forester named Brooks Mills. He's passed on, but his son is managing it. And he's specifically focused on growing high-quality hardwood sawlogs. Very pretty stand. This is a typical Maine spruce stand that you've all seen, but this is another type of forest we have around here. These trees are probably 60 to 80 years old. These take-home messages are important. There's a lot of cynicism about this. There are some very valid discussions going on. Um, it is an evolving process. So the take-home messages are: good people are working hard to develop and implement verifiable systems to store carbon in living trees and long-lasting wood products. There are good systems in place that are working. There have been mistakes, and people are working to correct them. This classic supply and demand situation will yield prices that will guide the market in actions. This is really important. This is basic economics. And supply and demand will be very important influences in how this goes forward. Large projects are more economical to develop and use. There's a real efficiency factor in larger projects. People are trying hard to find ways to include smaller landowners. In other words, largely sort of bundling people together in places. It's evolving. I hope it works, and we'll see. The evolution of LiDAR technology in helping to basically measure things from a distance, I think, is going to be a big factor in lowering costs for both large and small landowners. It's important to try not to be cynical. Try to look at this as a very important worldwide project and challenge. And as I said to begin with, basically, good people are trying to develop good processes. This picture is important to end with because it shows a variety of things. There are at least three softwood species that have regenerated here. This was a timber harvest that was done, and a lot of sunlight came. And so you have white pine on the right. You have two little balsam fir in the foreground. There's pine in the background, and there is spruce in the background. So here are a variety of ages and a variety of species. This happens to be a softwood site, meaning the soil is a little more acid and maybe a little drier than hardwood likes. But here's the future forest growing up happily in this stand and sequestering carbon. Thank you for your time.